Hey everyone, I'm Jason Brock, and today I'm going to talk about LGBTQ plus politicians in Japan and why they're elected even though there isn't equality for LGBTQ plus people in Japan. Hey everyone, welcome to the Jason Brock channel. I'm Jason Brock, and please subscribe and like and share this video if you like it. Also, become a patron, which is in my description below if you want to support my work. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about LGBTQ plus politicians in Japan, and maybe I'm just going to say queer to keep it easier to say because LGBTQ plus is quite a tongue twister even though it includes almost everyone. I'm just gonna say queer, and please know that I'm including everyone that I can in saying that word because it's easier to get off the tongue. So, as you may or may not know, there are a handful of queer politicians that have been elected in Japan. This is despite the fact that most politicians are heterosexual. Unfortunately, LGBTQ plus people in Japan don't have equal rights in every sense. There is some equality, but not as much as other Western countries. For example, gay marriage is not legal here. Queer people in Japan have limited protections and equality and fairness in the workplace and that sort of thing. But still, some queer politicians have found a way to get elected despite all of that. In my opinion, I think it's possible that three main factors contribute to the fact that queer politicians can still get elected in Japan despite the disadvantages. First is that in modern Japan, bias toward queer people, prejudice is decreasing. Also, in Japan, gender roles tend to be important. But when you are gay, bi, trans, etc., you are possibly given permission to do something outside what your normal gender role would be. For example, a man or a woman who maybe might be expected to do certain things as a woman in Japanese society could maybe go outside of that and go into politics. And of course, obviously, the third reason is that these politicians, queer politicians in Japan, have their own likability, charisma, party affiliation, so they have things that make them electable outside of being queer. Now, I did a lot of research on this. I actually did it last semester when I was at university, and there isn't a lot of scholarship, a lot of literature that goes into this specific subject, LGBTQ plus Japanese politicians, and why they're elected, how many have been elected, that sort of thing. There's a real lack of resources out there. However, there have been a lot of pieces about specific queer politicians in Japan, and just articles in the news and on websites and stuff, a lot of things like that, interviews with these politicians because they're interesting, and it's like, wow, a gay politician got elected, a trans politician got elected. So that there have been stories about that, but not so much why they got elected. However, there is literature out there that talks about public opinion of LGBTQ plus people in general. I said I wasn't going to say that, but I keep saying it. Queer is so much easier to say. It also literature that talks about gender roles in general and in Japan, and also what makes a politician electable. So that's the literature I used when doing my research on this. So most things that you'll read, most studies that you'll find, tend to agree that Japan is becoming more tolerant, more accepting of queer people in general. They're also more tolerant of queer people having rights, equal rights in general. Not all, but in general. So even though there's progress, that doesn't mean that it's completely great for queer people in Japan. But it is better if you look at the timeline over history. I also found literature that shows that how political likability and what political traits are desirable in a politician in Japan who gets elected. So that played into my research for this video too, because all politicians need strategies, connections, awareness, and all that stuff to win elections. More than just being queer is involved. That's not the main thing. It's also has to do with what they're running for, what their message is. Lastly, on the studies that I read, queer politicians are being elected more frequently because of the importance of gender roles. I think that queer politicians don't conform to the standard gender roles for their apparent gender. And because they're not expected to be in heterosexual relationships, well, because people know that they're not heterosexual, they allow they're allowed to do things outside of their normal gender roles. So, in a nutshell, about the scholarship and literature available on this subject, there isn't a lot available. That there's almost nothing specific to this particular issue. However, there is enough that I could put something together with and give you an educated theory of why queer politicians can be successful in Japan today. There aren't that many, but there are some. And let's go into it. So, there is a famous transsexual politician. Her name is Aya Kamikawa. Aya Kamikawa. And then there's a gay politician named Taiga Ishikawa. Taiga Ishikawa. They've been elected in Japan, I think because of the changing views toward queer people and also gender roles. You see the transgender part has maybe more to do with the gender role flexibility, I think. So about Japan becoming more tolerant toward queer people in general, in the past, homosexuality and transsexuality were part of Japanese history. It's been part of Japanese culture for quite a long time, actually. Not only did it exist, but it was tolerated and sometimes encouraged. This was especially in samurai and monastic cultures. In case you aren't aware, like the monks' society, internal society, they had same-sex relations for various reasons, and there was like a system involved. And also in the samurai culture, samurai often had male lovers, and that was also tolerated and even encouraged. There have also been fictional works about ancient emperors of Japan engaging in homosexual relationships, but those are fictional, so but it's an interesting insight. All the way back from the year 1008. 1008. That's a long time ago. Fictional or not, they were talking about it. And also, as far as the tolerance of LGBTQ people increasing, getting more tolerant here, Pew Research, which is very reliable, shows a 14% increase in the number of Japanese people who believe homosexuality should be accepted. From 2002 to 2019, 14% more people thought it should be accepted. In 2002, only 54% of people believed it should be accepted versus 68% in 2019, which as of now is about 2 years ago. So there's some statistical evidence or survey evidence that shows us, yes, people are getting more tolerant. Also, legally, Japan has begun to ban discrimination against queer people. And I'm going to quote this. In 2000, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government included sexual orientation as a category protected from discrimination within its new human rights guidelines. Now, that's Tokyo Metropolitan Government. That's not all of Japan. But still, that's really great. Sexual orientation, protected category from discrimination. Um, a lot of Japanese cities also, you may see, are having these rainbow pride events, which is like a pride celebration or parade. And so I'm seeing more of those everywhere. Even Hokkaido, I happened to go to one in Hokkaido, and I've been to one in Tokyo, and I know there are a lot all over Japan. So that's becoming big, which also seems to reflect tolerance and acceptance and maybe celebration of queer people. Also, you may have heard that a lot of cities are starting to allow same-sex marriage certificates, or I'm sorry, same-sex, is it marriage certificates or domestic partnership? Anyway, it's a certificate that allows same-sex people, couples, to get together in an official way, but it's still not the same as marriage on a federal level. It's just the local level. So that is progress. It kind of reminds me of the United States. I'm from America, so in the United States, before same-sex marriage was federally recognized, our presidents would often say, well, let's just send it to the states. Let each state decide. That's what this reminds me of. The cities are deciding, and maybe eventually the federal government will jump on board once they see that most of the country wants it or approves of it. So I do think we're seeing more acceptance of queer people in Japan, and that was some of the evidence that I found to support that. But even though there is more support, there are still problems like discrimination, bullying, marriage inequality, and more. One article I found said that the current consensus seems to be that queer culture is tolerated so long as it stays segregated and does not disturb the majority. I think that's true. I'm not Japanese, but from what I've heard, talking to other queer people, that seems to be true. Most scholars acknowledge there are still challenges that exist in Japan despite the victories. So the book Gay and Lesbian Communities the World Over said there are many problems with being gay or queer in Japan. They said, I quote again, although homosexuality is legal, Japanese society is not welcoming to people who publicize their homosexual status, making it difficult for people to advocate for gay and lesbian rights. Without legal recognition, gay and lesbian partners have the option to adopt their partners, like a child, or draw up contracts giving their partners rights to their finances, property, and children. Japan does not provide special accommodations to gays and lesbians in regard to immigration or asylum. The Tokyo District Court held in 2004 that an Iranian man's sexual orientation was not sufficient grounds to grant him refugee status. That was written in 2009. So there are problems, definitely problems. And another problem is homophobia in the government. The government itself has at times said things showing their intolerance of queer people. There's a lawmaker, an elected politician named Mio Sugita. In Japan, she was famous or notorious for some of the things she said. One thing she said about gay couples. She said that gay couples are unproductive and wondered whether it was appropriate to spend taxpayer money on them. Unproductive, I believe she was referring to not making children, I think that's what she was talking about. Of course, we know queer people can have children too, in various ways, depending on which part of the queer spectrum you are, but adoption is one of them. Anyway, another example of homophobia in the government is from the 90s. There was an LGBTQ plus group who sued the government for sexual discrimination based on sexual orientation. There was a building owned by the Tokyo Board of Education, and this is a government organization, right? Tokyo Board of Education. They refused to let gay men bathe together, although straight men could bathe together. So obviously that's a problem. But they did win the lawsuit. That's good. But still, that discrimination was happening from the government or a government entity. So again, Japan's becoming more tolerant, but still some problems too. So now I just want to move on to the gender roles. That was the tolerance portion of why politicians are getting elected more. LGBTQ plus queer politicians are getting elected more because people are more tolerant. But also, I believe there's a connection with gender roles, what a man, woman should do or shouldn't do according to Japanese society. Because they are not heterosexual, and they may be able to do things that heterosexual people in their gender role may not normally be able to do. For example, the Japanese public usually sees males as better leaders. This is not me saying this. This is from a study in 2018, which I will have links to all my references in the description of this video. There's going to be a lot, but they'll be there. Since a lesbian or trans female, for example, is already outside of typical roles for a female, Japanese voters might think that a queer woman or trans woman is more like a man. I don't know, but that might be kind of a change in thinking for what this person could possibly do versus just a regular heterosexual woman. I shouldn't say regular. Heterosexual woman. So they might be more desirable leaders than traditional women. The study says, I'm going to quote this, previous studies have demonstrated that voters, and this is in Japan, that voters view candidates from gendered perspectives. This in itself could lead to the gender inequality in elected office, which is a problem right now. There's not gender equality in Tokyo government. Of course, not everywhere either, but just saying. Okay, back to the quote. However, the scholarly literature has not made clear whether voters actually use candidate sex as a heuristic. I don't know if I'm saying that right. This is partly because various other cues about candidates, such as the candidate's party label and even party positions, are also available to voters. These other cues may overwhelm the effect of candidate sex on voter decisions, particularly the contemporary era, as public resistance to women in public life has declined and party cues have become so powerful. I think another way to interpret that is gender alone is difficult to distinguish from other factors when determining why someone wins an election. And I think that's true also with the queer factor. It's very difficult to say, did this person win or lose because they were a woman or because they were queer? Or did they win or lose for another factor? Because there's just so many factors there. Like what party they are, what campaign they ran, what affiliations they had. There's a lot there. Even what they look like, So it's a part of the picture, being queer, or being female or male or trans. That's part of the picture of why someone gets elected, but not the whole picture. My third reason that I think queer politicians get elected in Japan sometimes is also, lastly, because of their appeal. If they have charisma, an appealing platform, campaign effectiveness, connections, party affiliation, things like that. So some say certain qualities are more important than others, but definitely queer candidates are using similar tactics to their heterosexual counterparts. Running an election, whether they're queer or not, it's pretty similar, but of course a little bit different because there is the queer factor still, or gender factor. So there's a politician, Hosoda. Tomoya Hosoda. He was the first trans man, meaning F to M, trans man, to be elected in Japan. This was in 2017. He was not only campaigning for queer rights, though. He was campaigning for the rights of the disabled and elderly and other issues. Um, Also, another openly gay politician, Taiga Ishikawa, ran on a platform that also, it was not just about being queer. It was about legalizing same sex marriage, yes, and strengthening the rights of sexual minorities and women, yes, but also the disabled and other issues. So, again, it wasn't just about being gay or being queer or being trans or they ran a campaign to include all issues, to appeal to all people, and that is, in my opinion, of course, a reason that they are getting elected, whether they're queer or not. In fact, Tomoya Hosoda, the trans candidate, was praised as a good politician in general. Shinji Sugimura, the director of the local chapter of the Democratic Party, said Mr. Hosoda has succeeded because he didn't push his thoughts on others, but tried to be understood first. He is a good politician rather than an activist. Now, whether we think that is good or not, I mean, like, do we have a problem with activists? But still, he is strengthening my final point, which is that to get elected, you've got to be a good politician, not only an activist, or not only focus on that one issue. You have to be able to appeal to a broader group to get elected. I'm not saying if that's good or bad. I'm just saying that's the way it is, in my opinion. So, although it's impossible for me to find literature or studies that actually look at how political electability is affected by being queer in Japan, there is a study in the US that we could borrow from with a grain of salt. The study in the US shows that openly gay and lesbian candidates are actually less electable than their straight counterparts. So, is that true in Japan as well? We don't know, but it's likely if we were to kind of look at what happened in the US and then look at Japan, but different cultures. So, but I'm just going to say it's likely that it actually is more difficult for queer politicians to be elected. Yeah, like I said, it's hard to find data about this in Japan. And I even consulted my San Francisco State University, where I went to school. I consulted the library experts, the people who work at the library, who help you, research assistants. I contacted one of them and they said, well, I'm sorry, there's just nothing available. No data that really looks into that, at least not in English. Queer politicians in Japan and their success rate. But it's definitely something that I would love to research or love to see someone else research. Someone could maybe conduct studies to look at historically queer candidates and their heterosexual counterparts and compare maybe how many heterosexual versus queer candidates ran for office. We don't even know that. We could also look at how long their terms were, queer versus heterosexual, their success rate getting elected, also the success of candidates who we didn't know were queer or people didn't know were queer at the time they were elected, but then came out later, either during their term or after. That would also be interesting. And there is at least one of those from Osaka, I believe. I believe she's a lesbian. I don't have her name here though. Okay. So there's a lot that we don't know about the success of queer politicians in Japan without actual studies or literature to draw from. I think those three things are the factors that contribute to them being elected. More tolerance, not total tolerance, but more tolerance of queer people. Um, Gender role flexibility, flexibility in your gender role because you're queer. maybe you don't have to conform to the same gender role as the typical male or female. And lastly, the likability, the campaign, just what every politician has to do to get elected. They have to have the right issues, the right party, blah 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 blah. So I do think that Japan is more accepting and accepting of queer politicians. And we do see that increase of politicians being elected. I wish there were more studies, but in conclusion, I do think that Japan is starting to see beyond sexuality, sex, and sexual orientation to a certain extent, although there's still a lot of growth. But it seems like if you're a good politician, you have a chance to get elected. You definitely have a chance, and you very well may become a politician, even if you're queer, in Japan. And that's all I have for this video. Please subscribe, like, share if you like it, and join my Patreon. It's in the description. You can support me financially, and that would help a lot. Okay, thank you so much. And all my sources will also be below in the description if you wonder where I got this information. Have a great day. Bye.